Life often feels uncertain, full of twists and turns we didn't expect. But in the midst of it all, God offers us a promise. In Jeremiah 29 verse 11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." No matter where you are today, God's sovereignty over your future brings hope and assurance. He sees the bigger picture, even when we can only glimpse the next step. Are you ready to trust Him with your future? Can you embrace His plans, even when they feel beyond your understanding? The future He promises is greater than we could imagine. Do you dare to believe in it? But before we get to our topic, let's listen to the story of Joseph is one of the most powerful examples of trusting God with your future, even when the circumstances seem bleak or confusing. Here's a more detailed look at his journey. In Genesis 37, Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, Israel, and his favorite son, which made his brothers extremely jealous. At the age of 17, Joseph had two dreams that suggested he would one day rise to a position of great authority over his family. In one dream, his brothers' sheaves of grain bowed to his sheaf, and in the other, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed to him. When Joseph shared these dreams with his family, his brothers were infuriated and saw it as another sign of his pride. This jealousy led them to plot against him. One day, when Joseph came to check on them in the fields, his brothers seized the opportunity to throw him into a pit, intending to leave him there to die. Instead, they sold him to a caravan of Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt, and Joseph was taken as a slave. In Genesis 39, in Egypt, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Despite his difficult circumstances, Joseph trusted God and worked faithfully. The Bible tells us in Genesis 39 verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph, and he found favor with Potiphar, eventually becoming the head of his household. However, Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attempting to seduce her when he rejected her advances, and as a result, Joseph was thrown into prison. In Genesis 40, even in prison, Joseph continued to trust in God. He gained favor with the prison warden and was put in charge of other prisoners. During this time, two of Pharaoh's officials, the chief cupbearer and chief baker, were thrown into the same prison. Both had troubling dreams, and Joseph, with God's help, interpreted them. He predicted that the cupbearer would be restored to his position while the baker would be executed. Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him when he was restored to Pharaoh's court, but the cupbearer forgot about him for 2 more years. In Genesis 41, 2 years later, Pharaoh had 2 disturbing dreams that none of his advisors could interpret. The cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about him. Joseph was summoned from prison, and with God's help, he interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. The dreams foretold 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph not only interpreted the dream, but also advised Pharaoh to store up grain during the 7 years of abundance to prepare for the coming famine. Pharaoh was so impressed by Joseph's wisdom that he made him second in command over all of Egypt, entrusting him with the responsibility of overseeing the grain storage. In Genesis 42 to 45, when the famine struck, it affected not just Egypt but the surrounding regions, including Canaan, where Joseph's family lived. His brothers came to Egypt to buy grain, not knowing that the powerful man they were dealing with was their brother, Joseph. After testing them and seeing that they had changed, Joseph finally revealed his identity to them. He forgave them for their earlier betrayal and assured them that it was God's plan that he had been sent ahead to Egypt to save lives. In Genesis 45 verses 5 to 8, Joseph says to his brothers, "And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph recognized that despite all the wrong done to him, God had a greater plan. What his brothers intended for harm, God used for good. Joseph's faith in God's sovereignty and plan was unwavering, even when faced with betrayal, false accusations, imprisonment, and separation from his family. Joseph's life shows that even when we don't see the way forward, God is guiding us, and his plans for us are far greater than we can imagine. Trusting God with your future means believing that he is in control, no matter the current circumstances, and that he will work everything together for our good and His glory. Trusting God with your future is not just an act of surrender, but an invitation to experience His peace, faithfulness, and growth. It's the path that leads to a future filled with hope, promise, and a deepened relationship with the Creator. Here are 5 reasons why trusting God with your future is so important. The number 1. God's plan is greater than ours. Joseph's life began with a dream, showing his future greatness, but the journey to that future was far from easy. Genesis 37 verses 5 to 11 describes how Joseph's dreams caused jealousy and resentment in his brothers, who sold him into slavery. At this moment, Joseph could not see God's plan, and his future seemed bleak. Yet, as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that God's plan was far greater than Joseph could have imagined. Though his brothers intended harm by selling him, God was using these events to position Joseph to save many people, including his family, during a future famine. Genesis 45 verses 5 to 8. Joseph's journey teaches us that God's plan, though sometimes mysterious and difficult, is always for a greater purpose than we can see in the moment. We often get caught up in our own desires, goals, and plans, but God's understanding and vision for our lives far exceed anything we could imagine. While we may have a limited perspective of our future, God sees everything: our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, and He has a perfect plan that is designed for our ultimate good. Trusting God means surrendering our limited understanding and embracing the truth that He knows what's best for us, even if we can't always see it right away. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 assures us that God has plans to prosper us and give us a future full of hope. This trust opens the door to a future shaped by God's wisdom, far better than any plan we could design on our own. In Isaiah 55 verses 8 to 9, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." This verse reminds us that God's perspective is far greater than ours. His understanding and plans far exceed anything we could imagine. Often, we may not understand why certain things happen or why God's timing seems different from our own. However, this verse assures us that God's ways are always for our ultimate good, even if we don't fully grasp them in the moment. It calls us to trust in God's wisdom and timing, knowing He sees the bigger picture. Consider someone who has been working hard for a promotion at their job, but despite their efforts, they are passed over in favor of someone else. They feel confused and disheartened, wondering why their hard work didn't pay off. However, after some time, they look back and realize that the promotion would have required a move to a different location, which would have disrupted family life or other plans. As they trust in God's greater wisdom, they see that His plan was different but better, perhaps leading them to a more fulfilling role or a different opportunity that they couldn't have anticipated. This verse speaks to the trust in God's ways, even when they don't align with our own expectations. In Proverbs 19 verse 21, "Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails." This verse acknowledges that, as humans, we often have many ideas and ambitions. However, God's plan is ultimately what will come to pass. Despite all the plans we make, God's purpose will always prevail because He knows what is best for us. This is a reminder to align our desires with God's will and trust that His purpose will ultimately guide our steps, even when things don't go according to our own plans. Imagine someone who has a specific dream of opening their own business. They work tirelessly, planning and preparing, but things don't seem to fall into place as expected. Loans are denied, permits are delayed, and unforeseen obstacles keep arising. Eventually, they begin to feel frustrated and question if their dream will ever become a reality. Yet, over time, they realize that the delays led them to discover a different business opportunity, one that is more sustainable and aligned with their skills and passions. In hindsight, they see that God's purpose for their life was different, but ultimately far better than their own plans. This verse reflects the reality that God's will always prevail, and when we trust Him, we are led to the right path. Both of these verses remind us of the sovereignty and wisdom of God. Isaiah 55 verses 8 to 9 teaches that God's thoughts and ways are higher than ours, calling us to trust His bigger perspective. Proverbs 19 verse 21 emphasizes that while we may have many plans, it is God's purpose that prevails. By aligning our hearts with His will, we can find peace knowing His plans are always for our good and His glory. The number 2. God provides peace. Even in the midst of difficult circumstances, such as being sold into slavery and wrongfully imprisoned, Joseph experienced peace because he trusted God. In Genesis 39 verse 2, we read that the Lord was with Joseph, and despite the challenges, Joseph excelled in everything he did. Whether in Potiphar's house or in prison, Joseph maintained a peace that came from his trust in God's presence. When faced with temptation from Potiphar's wife, Joseph chose integrity, knowing that God's peace and approval were worth more than the temporary pleasures of sin. Trusting in God's presence provided Joseph with peace, even in the darkest times. One of the most difficult things about facing the future is the uncertainty that comes with it. Worrying about what may or may not happen can lead to anxiety, fear, and stress. When we trust God with our future, we are able to let go of this anxiety because we know that He is in control. Philippians 4 verses 6 to 7 encourages us to present our anxieties to God in prayer, and in exchange, He offers us peace that transcends our understanding. Trusting Him with our future means that we can find rest and comfort in the knowledge that He is sovereign and will work everything out according to His good will. This peace allows us to focus on the present moment, knowing that the future is secure in His hands. In Isaiah 26 verse 3, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." This verse assures us that when we place our trust in God and keep our minds focused on Him, He will grant us perfect peace. It emphasizes that peace is a result of trust and unwavering faith in God, especially in the midst of life's challenges. A steadfast mind remains fixed on God's promises and His character, leading to peace that transcends circumstances. It's a reminder that, even in uncertain times, true peace comes from trusting God with our hearts and thoughts. Consider someone who is facing a series of difficult situations, a challenging work project, family issues, and personal health concerns. Normally, they would feel overwhelmed by worry and anxiety. But as they consciously turn to God in prayer and focus on His promises, they begin to feel a deep sense of peace. Their mind stays calm because they trust that God is in control, even when things are uncertain. This verse becomes real for them as they experience peace that surpasses their understanding, grounded in the trust they place in God. In John 14, verse 27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." In this verse, Jesus speaks of the peace He gives, which is different from the temporary, fleeting peace that the world offers. The peace of Jesus is deep, enduring, and rooted in His presence, even in difficult times. He encourages us not to be troubled or afraid, assuring us that His peace will sustain us through every circumstance. This is a call to trust in the lasting peace that only Jesus can provide, rather than seeking the peace the world promises, which can often be uncertain or short-lived. Imagine someone who is going through a stressful period, perhaps experiencing tension in their relationships or anxiety about the future. The world might offer temporary distractions, but the peace they long for never lasts. When they turn to Jesus, spending time in prayer and reflecting on His words, they experience a deep, unshakable peace that brings rest to their troubled heart. Even though their circumstances haven't changed, they feel reassured and comforted, knowing that Jesus has given them peace that isn't dependent on the world's standards. Both of these verses emphasize the profound peace that comes from trusting in God. Isaiah 26 verse 3 assures us that when our minds are steadfast and trust in God, He will keep us in perfect peace. John 14 verse 27 reminds us that the peace Jesus offers is unlike anything the world can provide, lasting, deep, and sustaining. By focusing on God's promises and trusting in His presence, we can experience peace that guards our hearts and minds, regardless of external circumstances. The number 3. He has promises for our good. Throughout Joseph's trials, God's promises were evident. God promised to be with Joseph and to use him for a greater purpose. In Genesis 41 verses 14 to 16, Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, knowing that it was God's wisdom, not his own, that enabled him to rise to prominence. God promised Joseph that despite hardship, he would ultimately use him to save many lives, including those of his brothers and father during the famine. Genesis 45 verses 5 to 8. Joseph recognized that God's promises were for his good, and through the years, his trust in God's promises sustained him. His story reminds us that no matter how unclear our future may seem, God has good plans for us, and he will fulfill his promises in his perfect timing. Throughout Scripture, God makes it clear that his heart is for our good, not harm. Romans 8 verse 28 reminds us that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. No matter what circumstances we face, God is always working behind the scenes for our benefit, even in times of hardship or uncertainty. Trusting God with our future involves believing in his promises, that he will provide for us, protect us, and guide us toward a future that is full of purpose. When we surrender our future to him, we are allowing him to shape it in a way that will lead us to fulfillment, joy, and peace. In trusting his promises, we acknowledge that God's heart for us is always filled with goodness and grace. In Matthew 7 verse 11, "If you, then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" In this verse, Jesus compares the good gifts earthly parents give to their children, even though they are imperfect, to the abundant and perfect gifts God gives to those who ask him. It emphasizes that if even flawed humans know how to give good things, God, who is perfect and loving, will give far greater blessings to those who seek him. It encourages us to trust that God, our Heavenly Father, desires to bless us generously and will provide for our needs when we ask. Consider someone who is in need of financial help. They have been praying and asking God for guidance and provision. As they reflect on Matthew 7 verse 11, they remember the kindness they've received from their own parents, who would always give what they could when asked. With this in mind, they are reminded that God, being far greater than any earthly parent, desires to give them even more than they could imagine. Soon, they begin to see unexpected blessings, an unexpected bonus at work, a generous gift from a friend, or a solution to their financial problem. This verse reassures them that God delights in giving good gifts to his children. In Psalm 23 verse 6, "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." This verse expresses the psalmist's confidence in God's goodness and unfailing love, promising that these qualities will follow and accompany him throughout his life. It also highlights the eternal security and peace that comes from being in God's presence, both now and forever. The verse reflects trust in God's constant care and faithfulness, knowing that his love will never abandon us, and that we will ultimately dwell with him forever. Imagine someone going through a season of hardship, feeling isolated and uncertain about the future. However, as they meditate on Psalm 23 verse 6, they find comfort in knowing that God's goodness and love are always with them, guiding them through each day. Even in moments of doubt, they find peace in the assurance that God is faithfully caring for them. This verse becomes especially meaningful as they look to the future with hope, knowing that no matter the trials they face, God's love will continue to follow them, and they will one day be in his presence forever. Both of these verses highlight God's faithful provision and eternal love. Matthew 7 verse 11 assures us that God will give good gifts to those who ask, just as earthly parents give to their children, but with even greater abundance. Psalm 23 verse 6 reinforces the idea that God's goodness and love are with us throughout our lives, leading us to eternal security in his presence. These verses invite us to trust in God's generosity and faithfulness, knowing that he will care for us today and always. The number 4. God is faithful. Joseph's life is a testament to God's faithfulness. Despite being betrayed, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned, God remained faithful to Joseph. In Genesis 39 verse 21, even in prison, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness. God's faithfulness was evident in how he protected Joseph and caused him to prosper in whatever situation he was in. When Joseph's brothers came to Egypt years later during the famine, Joseph was able to forgive them because he knew that God had been faithful throughout his life, using even their wrongdoing for a higher purpose. Joseph's confidence in God's faithfulness allowed him to move forward without bitterness, trusting that God's plans were always for his good. One of the most beautiful truths about God is his faithfulness. He has never failed in his promises, and he never will. The Bible is filled with stories of God's faithfulness to his people, whether it's providing for the Israelites in the wilderness or showing mercy to the prodigal son. These examples remind us that God's commitment to his children is steadfast, no matter our circumstances. By trusting God with our future, we are leaning into his unchanging character. He has always been faithful in the past, and he will continue to be faithful in the future. Knowing this, we can walk forward with confidence, trusting that he will always be there to provide, guide, and protect us. In Lamentations 3 verses 22 to 23. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. This verse reminds us of the unwavering love and faithfulness of God. Even in the midst of hardship, God's love sustains us, preventing us from being completely overwhelmed by our struggles. His compassion is new every day, offering us fresh mercy and grace each morning. This passage encourages us to rely on God's constant faithfulness, knowing that no matter what we face, his love will never fail us. Consider someone going through a tough season of life, perhaps dealing with loss or facing a difficult trial. They may feel exhausted and overwhelmed by their circumstances, yet, as they reflect on Lamentations 3 verses 22 to 23, they realize that each day brings new mercy from God. They wake up to find that despite the challenges, they are not consumed by their pain or discouragement. Instead, they find renewed strength and hope in God's never-failing compassion. This verse becomes a source of comfort, reminding them that God's faithfulness will carry them through every new day. In Hebrews 10 verse 23, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. Asterisk. This verse encourages believers to hold firmly to the hope they have in Christ, knowing that God is faithful to fulfill his promises. In times of doubt or difficulty, it's easy to waver in our faith, but this passage urges us to remain steadfast, trusting that God will be true to his word. It's a call to maintain hope, anchored in the faithfulness of the one who has promised to be with us always. Imagine someone who is waiting for a long-awaited answer to prayer or a breakthrough in a personal situation. They have been trusting God for a specific promise, but the wait has been long and doubts begin to creep in. As they meditate on Hebrews 10 verse 23, they are reminded to hold unswervingly to the hope they profess, because God's faithfulness is unwavering. With renewed trust, they continue to wait, confident that God will fulfill his promise in his perfect timing. This verse becomes an anchor for their soul, reminding them that God is always faithful, even in the waiting. Both of these verses highlight the unshakable faithfulness and compassion of God. Lamentations 3 verses 22 to 23 reassures us that God's love and mercies are renewed each day, keeping us from being consumed by our struggles. Hebrews 10 verse 23 encourages us to hold firmly to the hope we have in Christ, knowing that God, who promised, is faithful. Together, these verses remind us to rely on God's faithfulness, trusting that he will always fulfill his promises and never leave us alone. The number 5. Trust leads to growth. Joseph's faith and trust in God led to spiritual growth and maturity throughout his journey. From a young man with dreams of greatness, Joseph grew into a wise and humble leader who understood God's sovereignty. His time in Potiphar's house, in prison, and his eventual rise to power in Egypt all prepared him for the leadership role he was called to. In Genesis 41 verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he became the governor of Egypt, fulfilling the dreams from his youth. His trust in God throughout his trials enabled him to grow into a man of integrity, wisdom, and compassion. Joseph's story shows that when we trust God, we may face difficulties, but they are opportunities for growth. Trusting God refines us and strengthens our character, preparing us for the purposes he has for us. Trusting God with our future doesn't just impact the outcome. It transforms us in the process. Trust challenges us to grow in faith and dependence on God. It requires us to step out of our comfort zone and let go of control, learning to wait on God's timing rather than rushing ahead with our own plans. Through trusting Him, we learn patience, humility, and perseverance. When we see God's faithfulness in action, it strengthens our faith and helps us become more Christ-like in the process. Moreover, it's in trusting God with the unknown that we experience the depth of His love and care for us. Our relationship with God deepens, and we find ourselves becoming more aligned with His will and purposes. Trusting God, then, isn't just about an outcome. It's about the transformation that happens within us as we rely more on Him. In Romans 5 verses 3-4, not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. This passage speaks to the transformative power of suffering in the life of a believer. It teaches that when we endure hardships, they shape and refine us. Suffering leads to perseverance, remaining steadfast through trials, which builds our character, making us more like Christ. Ultimately, this process produces hope, a confident expectation in God's promises. The verse reminds us that while suffering is painful, it is also a tool in God's hands to develop us spiritually and prepare us for greater hope and reliance on Him. Imagine someone who has experienced a prolonged period of personal struggle, whether it's dealing with health issues, relational difficulties, or financial stress. In the midst of the hardship, they feel overwhelmed and question the purpose of their suffering. However, as they reflect on Romans 5 verses 3-4, they begin to see that their perseverance through the struggle is strengthening their character. Over time, they become more patient, compassionate, and trusting in God's timing. Eventually, they find that their trials have led them to a deeper hope in God's faithfulness, knowing that He is using their experiences to shape them for His greater purpose. In Proverbs 3 verses 5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight. This verse calls us to trust fully in God, rather than relying on our limited understanding. It encourages us to submit every aspect of our lives to Him, recognizing that He knows the best path for us. When we place our trust in God, He promises to direct our steps and lead us in the right direction. It's an invitation to surrender our own plans and acknowledge God's wisdom in every area of life, trusting that He will guide us toward what is best. Consider someone who is faced with a difficult decision, like choosing between two job offers or making a major life change. They feel torn between their own desires and what seems logical, but they decide to follow the guidance of Proverbs 3 verses 5-6 by trusting in God's direction. Instead of relying on their own understanding, they submit their decision to God in prayer, seeking His will. In time, they experience peace and clarity as they follow God's leading, and they find that the path He has set for them is far better than what they had originally planned. This verse reassures them that when they trust God wholeheartedly, He will guide them along the right path. Both of these verses emphasize the importance of trusting God through all circumstances. Romans 5 verses 3-4 teaches that suffering has a purpose in shaping us, building perseverance, character, and hope. Proverbs 3 verses 5-6 invites us to trust in God's wisdom over our own, submitting our ways to Him, and receiving His direction. Together, they encourage us to embrace God's process in our lives, knowing that He will lead us through challenges and guide us toward His perfect will. In conclusion, trusting God with your future is an act of faith that brings peace, growth, and a deeper understanding of His plan for your life. Recognizing that God's plan is greater than our own allows us to surrender our anxieties and uncertainties, trusting that He is always working for our good. With His promises and faithfulness, we can face the future confidently, knowing that He will provide the peace and guidance we need. Ultimately, this trust in God not only strengthens our relationship with Him, but also leads to spiritual growth, helping us become more aligned with His will for our lives.